There are things we really try not to think about. Scenarios that seem like they belong in some grim blockbuster movie.
Right.
But what if that absolute unthinkable thing, a nuclear attack,
Yeah.
what if it suddenly became real?
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're going to get into today. Our guide for this, well, deeply unsettling journey is Annie Jacobsen's book, Nuclear War. It really pulls back the curtain on a future that feels terrifyingly
Well,
possible.
it's so important to understand that this isn't just like abstract thinking. Jacobson's work is really grounded. It comes from tons of interviews with people who are actually in U.S. nuclear command and control.
Right, the real decision makers.
Exactly. Plus declassified documents, historical accounts, and, serious analysis of how these conflicts could actually play out. It's based on real protocols,
Yeah.
existing tech.
Precisely. So our mission, if you will, in this deep dive is to really break down those critical first moments, that first hour, maybe, of a potential nuclear war.
Mhm.
We're focusing on a scenario that it really hangs over all strategic thinking. A sudden, unannounced attack, the bolt out of the blue, targeting Washington, D.C.
And bolt out of the blue, just so we're clear, that's the actual term U.S. Nuclear Command uses. It's their phrase for an unwarned large nuclear attack.
Yeah.
It's literally the nightmare scenario they plan for.
And the book, it just throws you right in. Bang! That first terrifying moment. An unannounced nuke hits the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And immediately, you're faced with this idea, something you hear in defense circles. There's no such thing as a small nuclear war. That first hit implies, well, rapid escalation, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. What you have to grasp right away is how interconnected everything is, how pre-programmed the responses are.
Mm-hmm.
In the minds of the planners, one detonation isn't just one event, it's a trigger.
Yeah.
A definite trigger in this incredibly complex web of potential retaliation.
Okay, so to really feel the weight of this, we need to step back a bit, right? This fear isn't new. The planning has a long and, frankly, pretty disturbing history.
It does.
The book takes us to this secret meeting, December 1960, U.S. Strategic Air Command.
Yeah, and what's so wild about that meeting is how they demonstrated it. It was almost like theatrical, but deadly serious. Inside this huge underground bunker,
Right.
they had this massive map, 150 feet long, projected on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And they're tracking a full-scale nuclear attack plan against the Soviet Union.
And it wasn't just a static map, was it? Jacobsen describes aides using plastic overlays and red ribbons.
Exactly. Every time a new wave of U.S. planes fighters, B-52s, each carrying multiple thermonuclear weapons was factored in, they'd untie more red ribbons, symbolically showing Moscow getting buried under layers of plastic, graphically.
It's chilling. And these weapons, we're not talking about slightly bigger bombs. We're talking thousands of times more powerful than Hiroshima.
Oh, way beyond. The scale of destruction they were contemplating it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. The book mentions figures like 4,000 times the yield of the Hiroshima bomb for some weapons.
4,000 times. It just forces you to confront this level of destruction they were planning for. And it gets even worse when you hear the casualty projections. Even back then,
Yeah,
there was another plan shown at that meeting, right? Targeting China.
that's right. And the most horrifying part of that briefing was the projection for deaths just from fallout.
Mm-hmm.
Radioactive fallout alone.
So fallout.
Yeah. They had a chart showing potentially 300 million deaths in China. Half their population back then. Just from the radioactive fallout drifting across borders.
300 million. Just from fallout. It's a number so big it almost doesn't mean anything, but it's unimaginable suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And in the middle of all this planning for mass death, there was one person who questioned it, wasn't there? General David Shoup.
Yes, General Shoup. His reaction is this kind of a stark moment of sanity, really, in all this strategic math. He flat out challenged the morality of it.
What did he say?
He basically said any plan that kills 300 million Chinese when it might not even be their war isn't a sound plan. And he added, it's certainly not the American way.
Wow. And the reaction.
According to the account, total silence. Nobody backed him up. It just highlights how normalized this terrifying scale of destruction had become, even then.
Truly chilling. And this kind of planning, it's not just ancient history, is it? It continues.
Oh, absolutely. It evolves, but it continues.
Thinking about those early plans, how much of that thinking still shapes things today? What does that tell us about the core assumptions behind nuclear war?
That's the key question, isn't it? While the targets and tech change, that basic framework deterrence through massive retaliation, it's still central.
Mm-hmm.
That history shows this deep-seated mindset focused on overwhelming force.
And accepting, well, devastating consequences as a necessary evil to prevent an attack in the first place.
It suggests the risks are still based on these decades-old ideas.
Pretty much. What started as the SIP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, has been updated, refined. The book says the current one is O-Plan 80-10-12.
O-Plan 80-10-12. Details are classified, obviously, but we know it's a family of plans. Targets potential adversaries, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. The fundamental reality of preparing for nuclear war is still very much with us.
So, with that unsettling history in mind, let's jump to a modern scenario from the book. The first few minutes after a launch, let's say 4:03 a.m. North Korea.
Okay. The scenario starts with this massive, unmistakable fireball erupting from near Pyongyang. It's the launch of their biggest ICBM, the Hwasong-17. Analysts call it the monster.
The monster. And within fractions of a second, the book says 0.4 of a second after liftoff, U.S. early warning satellites spot it, the SBR system.
Exactly. SBRs, SIBRs, as they apparently call it, space-based infrared system. They're basically looking for that intense heat signature from a rocket launch, like seeing a giant bonfire from orbit.
Incredible.
They're incredibly sensitive, designed to see that heat signature almost instantly. And that detection immediately kicks off this cascade of automated alerts through the U.S. warning network.
And it all feeds into places like Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, right? So 30 seconds after launch, alarms are going off, lights flashing.
That's the picture. Computers spitting out that message. Nuclear launch alert. By then, SBIRS has enough data to start plotting a trajectory.
And it looks like East Coast.
Initial assessment points to the U.S. East Coast, yeah. But even with data that seems clear, that seems immediate, there's this absolutely critical secondary verification step.
Because a false alarm, I mean, the consequences are unthinkable. You just can't risk it, can you?
Absolutely not. Even if everyone in Cheyenne Mountain sees the same data, one incoming missile, the immediate thought has to be, wait, one missile on its own. That doesn't really make sense for a first strike.
Right. It feels illogical somehow.
That uncertainty is the core of the problem, and that's why you have the over-the-horizon ground radars constantly scanning, looking for confirmation. Is there really a nuclear missile heading towards the U.S.?
They need that second source.
That near-simultaneous confirmation is considered absolutely essential before anyone even thinks about irreversible decisions.
And while all this is happening at lightning speed, you've also got U.S. Strategic Command STRATCOM deep under Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. They're also on highest alert now, like 60 seconds in.
Totally. STRATCOM is the brain, the central nervous system for all U.S. nuclear forces. It's from there, or from those doomsday planes.
The airborne command posts.
Right, the specially equipped Boeing jets.
Yeah.
That's where any nuclear war would actually be directed from. They're always ready to get airborne instantly if there's a major attack.
Okay, this brings us to a really critical and, frankly, terrifying concept the book dives into. Launch on warning. Can you break that down? Why is it considered so dangerous?
So launch on warning is basically a policy that says the U.S. could launch its own nuclear missiles before an enemy nuke actually hits U.S. soil.
Before impact.
Yeah. Based solely on detecting and verifying that incoming attack. The idea, the rationale, is to make sure our missiles aren't destroyed in their silos in a surprise attack, to preserve our ability to hit back.
Makes a grim kind of sense.
But as Jacobsen really hammers home through her sources, it leaves this incredibly dangerously short decision window for the president.
How sure are we talking?
Minutes. The book mentions calculations from way back 1960, estimating maybe 26 minutes from a Soviet ICBM launch to impact. North Korea might be slightly longer, but it's still incredibly fast.
Right.
The analysis in the book suggests the president has maybe only 6 minutes to absorb the data, grasp the consequences, and decide whether to launch a counterattack that could end civilization.
6 minutes.
6 minutes to process terrifyingly complex info, understand the stakes, and make that call. And as former Defense Secretary Perry points out in the book, the president, like most presidents since Kennedy, is likely pretty underinformed about the actual mechanics of how nuclear war works in those critical moments.
Oh, that's staggering. And just to add another layer of tension here, a big reason North Korea might even have an ICBM that can reach the U.S. East Coast. It could be down to stolen Russian tech, the RD-250 engine.
That's what experts like Ted Postel from MIT, cited in the book, suggest. He believes getting those RD-250 designs might have fast-tracked North Korea's progress by decades. Maybe gave them in months what would have taken years and years otherwise.
Wow. Shows how unpredictable proliferation is.
Exactly. And how quickly capabilities can change.
Okay, so back to the scenario. The North Korean ICBM is flying. U.S. missile defense kicks in. We're talking interceptors in Alaska. the sea-based X-band radar.
Right. The book details the sequence. Ground-based interceptors launch from Fort Greely, Alaska. They're
Wow.
designed for hit-to-kill, literally trying to smash into the incoming warhead.
Kinetic kill, no explosion needed from the interceptor itself.
Right. And at the same time, that huge sea-based X-band radar, basically a massive radar on a modified oil rig,
Uh-huh.
is tracking the threat, feeding data to the interceptors.
But how well does this system actually work? The book raises questions, doesn't it? Limited numbers, mixed test results.
That's a huge point. There were only 44 operational interceptors as of early 2024. And the testing record, well, it's patchy.
How patchy.
The book notes that between 2010 and 2013, none of the early interceptor tests actually worked. Zero success.
Oh.
And even after billions spent in more development, the probability of intercepting a single Hwasong 17, even under ideal test conditions, is maybe only around 55%.
55%. That's barely better than a coin flip.
Exactly. And in the book's specific scenario, the grim outcome is that 4 separate interceptors failed to take out the incoming North Korean missile.
So interception fails, the focus shifts entirely to the president, the red impact clock is ticking down, the president is rushed to the PEOC, the bunker under the White House.
Yep. Presidential Emergency Operations Center, deep under the East Wing, built originally back in World War II, hardened bunker.
And in those terrifying moments, they bring out the football, right? The briefcase with the launch codes. And the black book.
That's right. The football has the codes, secure communications. The black book supposedly lays out the pre-planned strike options, target lists, weapon yields, projected casualties.
So the president has these tools. What are they actually like? How are they used?
Well, the exact contents are top secret, obviously, but the book draws on accounts from people like former defense officials John Rubel, Daniel Ellsberg, people who had some insight. The general idea is it presents a menu of options, different target sets, different levels of destruction, different numbers of casualties. It's a choice of almost unimaginable gravity facing the president.
And the pressure. The book really emphasizes how unprepared most presidents are for that specific decision in that time frame.
Totally unprepared, psychologically and often technically. And adding to the chaos is just how hard it is to reliably reach other world leaders, especially, say, the Russian president.
Communication breaks down.
It can. The book mentions a real near miss in 2022. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs couldn't reach his Russian counterpart for over 24 hours after a missile incident. That fragility, right when you need communication most, it's terrifying.
Okay, the clock keeps ticking. Let's face the moment of impact. A 1-megaton bomb detonates over Washington, D.C. What does that look like, according to the book?
It's horrific. The blast wave radiates out for about 3 miles in all directions, like an unstoppable bulldozer. Winds of several hundred miles per hour, far stronger than any hurricane.
To buildings.
Within that zone, they just disintegrate, turn to dust and debris, bridges crumble, anything above ground is just ripped apart.
And then the mushroom cloud.
Within 60 seconds, it starts rising. 5 mile high, then 10, eventually spreading out tens of miles wide in the upper atmosphere.
And carrying the fallout.
Exactly. That witch's brew of radioactive products, as Carl Sagan called it, raining back down, contaminating everything. But that's just the start.
Just the start. What else?
The book describes a mega firestorm. Exploding gas lines, ruptured fuel tanks, everything igniting from the heat. Collapsed buildings become like giant ovens.
Oh, God.
Countless people just burned alive. Within 2 minutes of detonation, the estimate is over 1 million people in the D.C. area are dead or mortally wounded.
1 million people in 2 minutes.
Yeah, and FEMA. They'd be activated, sure. But the book says their best advice, realistically, would be for people to try and self-survive. Organized rescue. Utterly overwhelmed, infrastructure gone.
And the government itself. The book talks about evacuating the Secretary of Defense, maybe military rule if the president is killed, a decapitation strike.
That's a very real possibility outlined. If the civilian leadership is wiped out, military command might take over.
Right.
And Secretary Perry's assessment, based on his experience, is grim. Once military rule is imposed like that, peacefully going back to civilian control, almost impossible.
Wow. Okay, but the scenario doesn't stop there. It gets even more dangerous globally, right?
Right.
What about Russia's reaction? There's a spy involved?
Yeah, the book posits this chilling idea. An old Russian spy living undetected for decades near a U.S. Minuteman missile base in Wyoming. The moment he sees a U.S. launch, he makes a call to Moscow.
So even if the U.S. is retaliating against North Korea, Russia sees U.S. missiles launching.
Exactly. Their own satellites, tundra systems, their ground radars. They'd likely detect multiple U.S. ICBMs lifting off.
Huh.
So even though Russia didn't start the attack on D.C., suddenly they see incoming U.S. missiles. They're facing imminent nuclear attack themselves.
And this is where launch on warning comes back, but from the Russian side.
Precisely. The same insane pressure, the same tiny decision window faces the Russian president. Knowing they didn't attack D.C. doesn't matter if they think they're about to be obliterated by the U.S.
So they'd feel forced to launch their missiles immediately.
The book suggests it's highly likely. Immense pressure to launch a massive retaliatory strike to try and take out U.S. nuclear forces before those U.S. missiles can land. Under those circumstances, the Russian leadership probably would launch a full-scale counterattack on the U.S.
Which then triggers the full U.S. response. The acting president, the SecDef, probably ordering launches from SIDAR, that bunker in Pennsylvania.
Right. Raven Rock Mountain Complex, orders go out to launch everything left. All remaining Minuteman III from the Midwest silos, the Trident subs launching from under the oceans.
And it spreads. NATO gets involved.
The book touches on that too. NATO pilots across Europe getting emergency orders knowing their bases are now prime Russian targets. They'd be flying what are essentially suicide missions, maybe trying to use tactical nukes against advancing forces.
Total global war.
Pretty much. The scale of destruction becomes impossible to grasp. The book gives the example of Pyongyang, North Korea's capital, targeted by like 82 separate U.S. nuclear strikes, each one powerful enough to turn the city into a raging inferno. Obliterated.
82. But the horror doesn't end with the explosions, does it? The book talks about long-term effects. EMP.
Right. High-altitude electromagnetic pulse, a nuke detonated way up in the atmosphere.
And that could take out the power grid. Transportation.
That's the catastrophic potential, yeah. The book quotes experts, EMP commissioners, warning maybe 10% of all cars just stop dead. Permanently.
10%, that's huge.
It is. But the bigger systemic threat is losing the SCADA systems.
Mm-hmm.
Supervisory control and data acquisition.
SCADA. What's that?
Think of it as the nervous system for our infrastructure. It controls power flow, water pressure, transport networks, everything. Losing SCADA means everything goes haywire.
Like what?
Trains collide, signals fail, elevators become traps, satellites start falling out of orbit. And critically, the book points out the danger to the nuclear power plants. 53 operating plants in the U.S.
Oh.
They'd rely on backup power, which would eventually fail, potentially leading to meltdowns, more catastrophe.
And then nuclear winter.
Yeah. All those massive fires burning across the northern hemisphere, cities, forests, pumping incredible amounts of soot and smoke into the upper atmosphere. The estimate cited is around 150 teragrams of soot.
And that blocks the sun.
Blocks a significant amount of sunlight for months, maybe years. Global temperatures plummet, agriculture collapses worldwide, mass starvation on a scale we can't even imagine, billions threatened.
Billions.
The book mentions those classified war games the U.S. military ran called Proud Prophet. No matter how they started the simulation, no matter the scenario, they all ended the same way.
Yeah.
Complete Armageddon. No winners. Just total destruction.
It's almost too much to take in. The book ends by suggesting
Or
a return to a pre-civilized state? Hunter-gatherers?
it raises that specter, yeah. Referencing Göbekli Tepe, that ancient site in Turkey built before agriculture. As a reminder of how fragile civilization is, how easily it could all be wiped away.
So, wrapping up this deep dive into nuclear war, the main takeaway seems pretty stark and terrifying. A nuclear war, even if it starts small, has this terrifying potential for uncontrollable escalation, engulfing the whole planet.
Absolutely. Those incredibly short decision times, the launch on warning policies, they created this huge risk of miscalculation. Technical error, misunderstanding, boom, global nuclear exchange.
And the long term. Environmental catastrophe, food collapse, the actual survival of humanity threatened, it's almost paralyzing to think about.
It really leaves you with this profound sense of unease, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The book ends by echoing the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He's called nuclear weapons insane, irrational. And he warns constantly that we're on this razor's edge, one mistake, one misunderstanding away from nuclear annihilation.
It really makes you think hard about this threat still hanging over us, maybe even more so today.
Yeah.
And the urgent need to find some way, anyway, to reverse course before it really is too late.